Welcome to Advisor Wars, the podcast where we take a critical look at the key issues facing the financial advisor profession. My name is Bob Hoopsher, and co-hosting with me is Joe Halpern, Managing Partner and Chief Investment Officer of Obsidian CIO. I was the founder of Advisor Perspectives and led it as CEO until 2024. We are recording this in early March, and this is a special episode on the role of artificial intelligence in wealth management. Over the next 45 minutes, you will hear from one of the top experts in AI about how this technology will transform our economy and more specifically, the impact on wealth management. Our special guest is Alex Wisner-Gross. Alex's biography and accomplishments are too numerous to cite, but we have a link to his website in the notes that accompany this podcast where you can read for yourself. He is a director or advisor for several AI companies. He also authors a daily newsletter, the Innermost Loop, and there is information about how to subscribe to that in the podcast notes. He co-hosts a weekly podcast with Peter Diamandis called Moonshots, also focused on AI, and there's a link to access that in the show notes as well. If you notice a slight resemblance between Alex and me, that is not a coincidence. Alex is also my second cousin once removed. His grandfather and my mother were first cousins, and they were actually very close to one another their entire lives. So Alex and I have known one another for a long time. And one final disclaimer, Alex is not a financial advisor. Nothing that he says should be considered financial advice. So Alex, let's start off. There's a point of terminology that I want to address. You refer to the singularity, and my understanding is that refers to a time when artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming humanity. Is that an accurate definition? And are we in the singularity now? And what would cause you maybe to revise your view?
Well, thanks for the softball, Cousin Bob. Glad to be here. Singularity is a loaded term. It's a term that goes back to well before Ray Kurzweil popularized it, back before even Werner Vinge coined the modern term, the technological singularity, goes back to I.J. Good and the notion of an intelligence explosion achieved through recursive self-improvement. So the term singularity to some means AI that is improving itself to the point that capabilities start to skyrocket. To some, such as in the Ray Kurzweil camp, it evokes notions of a firewall that one can't see past due to technological change and growth improving at a speed beyond human cognition. I typically use it more to evoke a notion of a set of converging technologies where AI is very much at the center, but a set of converging technologies and discoveries that humanity, post-humanity, will look back on in a couple decades and say, this was a major step function in time, but not in math. There are those like my friend Ray who would say, well, singularity is a point in time. I would take a different position. I think the singularity, in my definition, again, subjective, mushy term, is going to end up being viewed as an interval in time that maybe spans about 10 years or so, maybe 15 years. I think artificial general intelligence, another term that's become relatively mushy, I would say hit no later than the summer of 2020 when OpenAI published GPT-3, and we learned that it is indeed possible for large language models to achieve generality in task performance. If I had to put a ballpark on when the time interval for the singularity is, I would say maybe rough around the edges, but maybe sometime around summer of 2020 start. And I would expect that with the benefit of hindsight, we'll say that some of the most transformative changes will have concluded by, say, 2035. So call it a 15-year time period.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's talk about some of the economic effects. In what areas is the singularity exerting the most significant influence on our economy? Where is there measurable automation that's already showing up in the data? And what's the best example of an unsolvable problem that's now solvable?
Oh, ask me one question at once, please. Too many questions, too overloaded. So
all right,
where
let's
would you
start
like to
off
start?
with
That's
the
three totally
where
separate
it's exerting
questions.
the most influence.
Well, I think it's borderline indisputable at this point that we're in the middle of an historically exceptional build out of infrastructure. So the most obvious point of intersection with the economy right now is the AI data center build out and the entire supply chain behind it. So the chips, the fabs, the energy, and then downstream, the robots. This is what I call often the innermost loop, is why I named one of the reasons why I named my daily newsletter the Innermost Loop. This idea that we're seeing at a civilizational and macroeconomic scale recursive self-improvement in the form of robots that are now increasingly helping to build fabs that are producing chips that go into data centers that are being used to train models, consuming a lot of energy, and those models are then being used at inference time to feed back into the robots. And this is what I've in the past called the innermost loop. It's spinning more and more quickly as positive feedback kicks in. So I think that innermost loop of infrastructure is the most obvious entry point into the economy in general. It's not necessarily where productivity statistics show up. Again, like productivity everywhere except in the statistics. That was the catchphrase from decades ago. But even recently, like in this morning's newsletter, I covered for the nth time the productivity statistics at the macro scale, not just microeconomic statistics, are finally starting to reflect AI productivity gains. So productivity gains, there's this notion of the Moravec paradox from Hans Moravec that the machines tend to be good, at least initially, at the tasks that humans are bad at, and bad at the tasks that humans are good at. So the initial productivity gains are shock of shocks coming from displacing and automating so-called white-collar labor. And over time, where in my timelines, the time scale is 2 to 3 years, 2 to 5 years, something like that, the machines will work their way from skilled mental or cognitive human labor to so-called unskilled or semi-skilled human manual labor as humanoid robots and other robotic deployments kick in. So all of these productivity gains, they're already starting to be felt. They're just starting to be felt at the macro scale. They've already been felt for the past few years at the microeconomic scale in various industry verticals. But I tend to think, I'm full of cliches this morning. It's a recession if your neighbor is unemployed, but it's a depression if you're unemployed. People won't, I think, many people won't intrinsically feel the economic power of the singularity until there are robots in the streets. So I think that robots in the streets moment is going to hit the US in the next, call it 2 to 4 years. It's already hit in parts of China, major urban centers. For whatever reason, good or bad, the US is operating on a bit of a time delay at this point, and I think it's going to hit in the next couple of years.
Well, that's a good segue to my next question. What's the importance of America winning in the AI space, and what does that really mean?
Well, in some sense, there are multiple stories that one can portray. I could portray the cliche of East versus West, Chinese open weight models versus Western closed models, or China's AI plus strategy, the 5-year plan to focus on extreme AI integration with the industrial ecology versus the more characteristically Western approach of horizontal stratification and weaker or looser unification between the model builders and the data centers and the state. I think those are all relative cliches. I think the more interesting story is that the world is racing toward extreme superintelligence and even post-superintelligence. And I think in the fullness of time, even though it looks like superficially perhaps, like an arms race in the weapons style, I think history will reflect it was less akin to a nuclear arms race and more akin to an Apollo program style space race where humanity wins as a result of all of this competition to build out superintelligence, both the infrastructure layer of superintelligence, the algorithmic layer of superintelligence, so that's better and stronger models, and then the applications, finding ways to enhance the intelligence of civilization. I think ultimately almost everyone or everyone wins from that race.
Alex,
It's positive sum.
Yeah, first of all, I love the optimism. Way rather be going for the Apollo moon race as opposed to the nuke race. So hopefully you got that one right. Historically, major technologies like mechanization has increased productivity and eventually created new industries and jobs. Agriculture, industrial revolution, secretaries back in the 60s, 70s. Do you think AI follows that same pattern, or is it fundamentally different because it automates cognitive work?
Another softball, it does both. AI is both going to replace lots of jobs that I would argue humanity will be better off having automated in the end anyway. And it will also create lots of new jobs. It will create jobs in the space world, which I think is an incredible domain. We're going to get our moon colony and our Mars colony and our orbital Hiltons like 2001: A Space Odyssey promised us. We're also going to get all sorts of jobs, quote unquote, that weren't in Arthur C. Clarke fever dreams. We're going to get, I think one of these crazy statistics is, I forget the exact number, but some disproportionately high or surprisingly high percentage of new job creation is influencers on social media. We're going to get all sorts of crazy job titles. I just co-authored a book with my friend Peter called Solve Everything, where we argue that many jobs will get created around this notion of benchmarking everything and solving entire disciplines, and then shaping the targeting and verification infrastructure for solving entire disciplines. So I would say at a high level, many jobs I expect, and again, I'm almost having to stop myself from using the word job because I think it's such a 20th century almost pre-relic at this point. I'm not sure I've ever had myself anything remotely considered a normal job. So perhaps I'm not one to speak, but I tend to think many of the forms of economically productive activity, call it, that will be created in the near-term future would look like video game play or gameplay or just self-entertainment to an objective observer from 100 years ago. And so you could ask, is it economically productive activity being an influencer? Well, it does create economic activity, and it can certainly shape, if the influence is positive, overall macroeconomic outcomes. I think the more interesting jobs will relate to scaling up the ambition of what humans achieve. And this is something in many of the forecasts, prognostications, I see that strikes me as completely wrong. This notion that the avocations of humans today are somehow representative of what humans and post-humans will be capable of and or find desirable in the future. I think that couldn't be further from the truth. We're going to be solving much harder problems than the typical human, unaided biological human, could be solving today in return for some economic compensation. And yet, at the same time, these much harder problems will probably look a little bit like child's play.
Thanks for that, Alex. I know here at Obsidian, I'm using AI all day. We're increasingly using AI, and we believe it dramatically increases our productivity. Economically, historically, increasing productivity has led to a deflationary environment. Do you think AI creates that sustained deflationary pressure on the economy? And this will be the same question, but two-part. You have singularity going from 20 to 35. So I do want to break it up if you think it's going to be sustained deflationary pressure over the singularity and after, or, but if you don't mind using those timeframes or at least addressing them.
Well, the elephant in the room is that we have a centralized banking system that is more than capable if and when we encounter hyperdeflation. That's the result of AI and technological hyperdeflation. Is more than capable of printing money, and we can print our way into hyperdeflation if we have to. So I tend to think that any latent deflationary pressure or hyper-deflationary pressure as a result of the intelligence explosion and the singularity, we have the state capacity to hyperinflate our way back to a target inflation benchmark? And will the headlines reflect one day technological hyperdeflation causes dollars to deflate, save your money, don't spend it, put it under your mattress one day, not investment advice. And then the next day, headlines blaring, technological inflation, dollars are worthless, set them on fire, whatever, not investment advice. I think absolutely we will see those sorts of bipolar headlines as we see swings between hyperinflation, hyperdeflation, and back. That's volatility that one would expect from rapid technological change, not investment advice to trade the VIX, but that's the model that's in my mind.
I got you. Okay, so we are relying on the Fed. We'll go with it to kind of roll it. I think the Fed does a pretty good job. So in late February, Citrini Research released a viral memo. It was called the 2028 Global Intelligence Crisis. It was framed as a thought exercise. So, we have to caveat it with that, but it described a hypothetical worst case where rapid adoption of AI destroyed the economy, caused massive white-collar unemployment, severe deflationary spiral, sell-off in software. Can you go? We're getting a little bit of your flavor here on this episode, but could you talk a little bit more what your take is on that and maybe a counter?
My take in one phrase is ho-hum. People, for whatever reason, some people love to paint a downside, love to paint dystopian outcomes. I'm not sure whether that's because there's something intrinsic in human nature that loves to understand and maybe even fantasize about dystopias, or whether that's just what the sort of narrative that becomes most viral. I don't think a scenario as linear as the Citrini 2029 or 2028 rather scenario is likely. I think the real world ends up being far more complicated than any single sort of narrow scenario building exercise. Similarly with the AI 2027 scenario, similarly with situational awareness, although I think AI 2027 and situational awareness were far more legible and credible as scenarios than Cintrini's work. It's challenging for me to come up with a credible, defensible scenario where just everything goes wrong. I don't think that's likely. There's simply too much intelligence built into the system, and also too many left turns that I think are likely to hit civilization over the next few years, that painting a sort of naive Hollywood cinematic style of technology destroys all the jobs, pulls down the economy with it, the SaaS apocalypse infects everything, there's no way for anyone to make money, it's a race to the bottom. I don't think this is a credible scenario, in part because I think it's overly simplistic.
Thank you.
Alex, let's turn to some specific effects on the financial advisory profession and wealth management. The people who work in a typical advisory firm fall into four broad categories. There are financial planners who work with clients to understand and solve their problems. There are people doing business development, rainmakers who work to attract new clients. There are the operations folk who process trades and create reports and handle administrative tasks. And of course, there's management. How do you envision AI transforming or replacing those roles?
Well, okay, so I'm going to speak to the elephant in the room and ask the question, how much of that activity is actually economically productive? And to the extent that some of it is economically productive, I imagine that gets automated. To the extent that any of it is not, I imagine that over time, as the economy becomes more efficient with more intelligence, many of those functions can go away.
So yeah, I'll do a follow-up on that. Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Did you want to?
So do you have a sense for, I think the typical advisor would say that all of those four roles are economically important and economically productive. Do you have a sense for the sequencing or which ones are most vulnerable?
Well, let's pick one of the ones that you mentioned, which is marketing. Marketing is sort of, I think a microeconomist would say, the classic example of non-productive activity in some sense because there's a competition for scarce attention. So I would cross off marketing if this is something that's creating lots of intrinsic value. Marketing is probably, if anything, to the extent it's perhaps subsidizing positive economic value creation, real wealth creation, I suppose on a net basis it's positive, but probably in other circumstances, if you take out the cross subsidies, probably not that economically productive as one example. Really the mental model in my mind is, again, the elephant in the room, and I don't know how to put this even more politely. It seems a little bit strange to me that in a world, not investment advice, of index funds, robo-advisors, and superintelligence, where everyone in principle has access to the superintelligence that comes not just from individual models, but as Jack Bogle would say, from the collective wisdom of the market, that financial advice in general isn't more of a fungible commodity that has been already, in some sense, largely automated with its margins ground to the dust. That's the most polite formulation I can come up with on a moment's notice.
I appreciate it. That's it. Alex, this is the first time you're pessimistic, and it's about the financial.
No, this is extreme. It's extreme optimism. It's macro optimism. Maybe it could be construed as pessimism for financial advisors, but it's macro, totally optimistic.
So people who own RIAs, people in the financial advisory space, as we go through this, what would you recommend? How do they approach AI? Like, where should, my sense of it is that this probably applies to every single industry, a dramatic variance of use where some people are not touching it and others are really, really leaning in. I could speak to my own experience soon, but how do you think, what's the best way to just kind of understand and take advantage of AI within the space?
Well, I think the obvious advice to give, and this is not specific to investment advisors, is I think we should 9 times out of 10 be seeking to automate ourselves out of whatever quote unquote job we're doing. So to the financial advisors listening, automate yourselves out of your jobs. That's the most obvious path to real wealth creation. And there are many ways to do that. I would say one of the most obvious steps in so-called knowledge work is to at least make sure that all of your processes are written down or stored electronically in some sense. If what you're doing can be written down, if the inputs and the outputs exist in electronic form, then you're already 90+% of the way toward either full automation now or full automation in the next year or two, given progress on benchmarks like GDP Val that was sponsored by OpenAI, but has since become more broadly adopted. This is a benchmark that measures frontier AI model ability to automate general knowledge work. If what you're doing essentially boils down to inputs coming in as documents and outputs going out as documents or emails or some sort of electronic data format, this is probably going to be automated in the next year or two. And if I were a financial advisor, I'd be looking for a way to automate myself out of a job.
Thanks for that. So you mentioned robo-advisors, and robo-advisors, I'll call it like a decade ago, were supposed to take over the industry, and they did not. They generally have not done well at all. One reason they may not have done well is the trust factor. And I wonder about that. When you think about a financial advisor's roles, one of their roles is kind of being a therapist for their client, helping out. If you think about AI, maybe creating that prompt for AI so AI actually understands them. And so for this question, I really want to focus on the trust factor there, which applies to financial advisors. My wife's a therapist. It applies to therapists. Could you talk to that component of human to human relations versus human to AI relations, and how maybe AI overcomes the trust factor, or whether that trust factor is always there and we just change the job title to something different for a financial advisor?
Yeah, maybe it should be financial therapist rather than financial advisor.
Yeah.
I think some of this is generational. If you look at the statistics, many people in their teenage years are trusting what historically perhaps conversations of a certain level of trust and confidentiality that would have been communicated with friends or trusted adults. Instead, they're happening with AIs. So the obvious response I want to reach for is this seems very generational, and a younger generation, quote unquote, will be leaning against and trusting AIs much more heavily than perhaps older, more moneyed generations are willing to. So, as with this, the conversation almost reminds me of the conversation that we could be having in the 1990s, talking about, remember, all of these physical paper flows were supposed to be automated, and there were people hand-wringing in the 1990s, where's the paperless office? Why hasn't the paperless office arrived? We're printing more paper than we ever have before. And yet, the paperless office did in fact arrive. It took perhaps a little bit longer, and you're always printing more paper while you're being disrupted from underneath by electronic workflows. But whether it's robo-advisors a few years from a few years ago, perhaps taking slightly longer due to generational psychologies than one would otherwise expect. Yes, I do expect what would currently be construed as financial advice to be largely or entirely automated in a few years. And you'll always have people who want authenticity, maybe call it, of a financial therapist. But for the actual nuts and bolts of advice, the AIs have well-informed. This is not investment advice, so I don't aspire to be a financial therapist, but the AIs have well-informed views on finances already.
Alex, I've listened to a number of the podcasts that you've done, and one of the things you said is that the concept of retirement is fairly new in the scope of human evolution. I think you said it was conceived of in the Napoleonic era, perhaps in the early 19th century. How will AI transform retirement, and what should advisors be thinking about in order to prepare for that?
I think retirement is, in one sense, cooked. It's a relatively modern invention that had its time. It's time to retire retirement. In another sense, I would say, again, going back to my earlier comments, the activities that 20, 30 years ago one would reasonably construe as retirement activities will look like normal, economically productive activities in 10, 20 years. So on the one hand, I want to say retirement is over. It was a product of both political change and also industrial change, and also the lack of longevity escape velocity, which I do expect humanity is going to hit sometime at the very latest by the early 2030s, further retirement. But I think this notion that people at some point should be expected to just stop being economically productive and switch to consumption mode, I think this is both overdue for an end, for its own retirement, but also I think the form of economic productivity is going to look like consumption soon anyway. So maybe in that sense, no one's retired and everyone is retired.
So let's go to capital markets for a minute. So there's this efficient market belief, the efficient market frontier, where everybody has all information and everything trades to a certain point. Has AI been able to, and you see in the market, obviously, there's a lot of movements based on capital flows and other elements that affect it, where it doesn't quite look like efficient markets. How's AI being used now in the investment process, to your knowledge? And do you see it kind of, as mentioned a couple minutes ago, do you see it kind of, if AI is all getting to the same point and they're all seeing the same investments, I'm trying to figure out in my head whether that creates more volatility or less volatility, where prices just snap exactly where they should go.
Yeah. Where's the alpha is the question.
Yeah.
Where's the alpha in an AI traded world, which is, by the way, the world that we are in and have been in for a number of years. Most of the volume in public securities markets, at least in the US, is algorithmically traded. The algos dominate public markets. So we're already in that world. And I would further compound that with the shift from day trading and individual or private active stock picking and security picking to indexing, which is on top of the AIs plus the broad macro secular trend toward indexing. The market, it's not on autopilot, but it's in some sense, I think there's probably an equilibrium point where a relatively de minimis fraction over time of the market becomes actively traded. I think that over time, I would expect, not sure why in some quarters this would even be considered a hot take. I think the trend lines are pretty clear on this, that we'll see a near-term future where only a tiny fraction of daily volume is actually actively traded. The other half of your question is, do I think that's going to spike the vol or not? That requires that I have a crystal ball regarding volatility. I don't have a crystal ball on the VIX, and it's an excellent question for the AIs, but fortunately we have volatility futures. So one can read out volatility futures markets and attempt to divine from the AIs that are trading their own futures what they think their own volatility is going to be in the future. But I do think indexing plus AI trading is both the present and future of where markets go.
So right now, the three largest index companies are Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street. They have indices that are claimed to be on the exact same sectors and areas. But for reasons we're not going to go to on this call, because there are reasons for it, they use different index providers. And they actually have tracking error with each other. And different components of the market use different of these products. So I wonder, are we going to have one great big index that's perfectly optimized? Because you could argue that those three indices are doing different things. There's some level of tracking error, which shows that they're different. They're making different decisions. In that AI world, does it all kind of come together and converge into one? Is there one winner?
I tend to think, so the question as posed is not dissimilar to the question of, say, pair trading strongly correlated securities in different countries. And of course, the answer to that and so many other related questions is statistical arbitrage. So to the extent there's an arbitrageable delta between related indices, I expect quant firms have arbitraged that alpha away long ago to the point where there's not much individual insight. I would expect non-investment advice to be gained by trying to game or otherwise pit or try to cleverly combine indices together due to minor disparities between them.
Yeah, it's not really arbitrage. I think it's more definitional right? So it comes down to, like, for instance, Amazon's not in tech, right? It's consumer. So I think it is a little bit definitional. And then it may be,
Yeah, that's a sector leaning, though. Again, that's it. When I speak of the indices, I'm not speaking of sector indices. I'm speaking of total market indices that are completely agnostic to particular sector definitions. No tilts, in other words.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, fair. Good enough. Go ahead, Bob.
Alex, I want to come back to something you said earlier about increasing lifespans. I think you said they would increase dramatically over the next 1 or 2 decades. How is that going to happen? What are what's your outlook for solving the major diseases that shorten our lives, either physically or cognitively, like cancer, dementia, so forth?
Yeah, I was just a few months ago at the NeurIPS conference, which is the largest AI conference in the world, and it was pretty striking on the showroom floor how much of a consensus there is among some labs, both for-profit and not-for-profit, that have billions of dollars in funding, that we're going to solve all disease over the next, call it, 5 to 7 years. This is pretty much in some quadrants of the AI community, pretty much the consensus that we're going to solve all disease in the next 5 to 7 years. And what that looks like concretely, the emerging consensus is and there are a number of projects pursuing this, there are efforts to train what's called a virtual cell. The idea is basically just as GPT, the GPT model series and large language models were trained or pre-trained, I should say, off of all human internet data. There are a number of labs now focusing on training so-called virtual cell models off of enormous amounts of individual cell data, both genomic data, proteomic expressions, the entire intervention space of if you sprinkle small molecule pharmaceuticals on top of cells, what happens? How does it change their genomic and proteomic expression? So building the world's basically best single cell simulators that are capable of simulating every type of cell in the human body and also cells from non-human species. So this is, in some sense, I think, if I were to try to capture the zeitgeist of AI for the life sciences, this is the holy grail, building the world's most accurate single cell simulator that will be basically a GPT-3 moment for entire cells. If we can do that, and a lot of progress is already being made, then we can scale that up from a single cell simulator to an organ simulator and a whole body simulator, at which point the problem of curing all disease reduces, in some sense, to the problem of taking a simulator that, by the way, is going to be orders of magnitude faster than any human clinical trial and subjecting it to lots of combinations of interventions to discover which interventions take a diseased state and steer it through cell space or organism space to a healthy state. And this is, in fact, what's going on. There are multiple competitions and benchmarks out there measuring the ability to steer virtual cells from diseased states to healthy states. And in my mental world model of how we cure all disease, how the West was won, except it's how disease was conquered rather than the West being won, it looks something like that. You take the top 5,000 plus diseases, many of which, by the way, the majority in the top handful of diseases that as of yet are untreatable or haven't yet been cured are neurological in nature. Taking the top 5,000 plus diseases, there are already ontologies for this, formalizing the definitions of their disease states, and then using these virtual cell models to identify intervention trajectories through cell space from diseased to healthy. And this is, I expect, going to happen over the next, call it 5 to 7 years, bringing us by the early 2030s to an era of so-called longevity escape velocity, where technological advances are adding more than 1 year of life expectancy to everyone, some definition of everyone, per year.
So, Alex, that sounds like, just to be careful, that it sounds like we will have longer, healthier lives, but we will still die, hopefully, just to make room for the next generations, or...
Totally disagree,
Okay.
both at the premise level and the inference level. So I'll address the premise level first, that somehow generations have some sort of moral obligation to die to leave room for subsequent generations. 1,000% disagree with the premise of that. I think death, 150,000 people on this planet die every day. I think that is a tragedy, and I think it is, I'll evoke Russian cosmist philosophers here. I think it's part of humanity's common task to put an end to mortality. I have a number of efforts that are working in that direction, including a portfolio company that I co-founded that's working on making human mind uploading work, ideally in the next 5 or so years, so enabling humans to upload their minds to the cloud. I think the moral imperative is the exact opposite. I think there's a categorical imperative to cure mortality, not in some sense some scarcity-motivated notion of generations dying off to create room for other generations. I think a more abundance-oriented mindset is how I would recommend, certainly how I think and how I would recommend other people think. And to the first half of the question of whether mortality will still be the case after longevity escape velocity, yes, people will still get hit by buses. Accidents will happen on the one hand. On the other hand, in parallel with curing all disease, curing all accidents, I think is also very much in the cards. And I think there are a variety of ways, even in a near-term future where biotech has basically cured all disease, where we address all accidents or call it murders or other means of violence that would otherwise take healthy people and cause their mortality. I think mind uploading will be part of that solution so that you always have backups that are in sync, that are running in different places, so it's functionally impossible to kill someone. There are going to be other technological interventions as well. But I would say in the broader scheme of things, it's both essential and also likely that humanity will find a way to cure all disease and also cure mortality.
I wasn't really worried from a moral level. I was more worried about intergenerational conflict, given older generations have all the goods and the youngers don't. But maybe Bob's a little ahead of us. Maybe we could keep them down.
Think of all the scary stories financial analysts can write about intergenerational conflict and how awful it's going to be for family offices if families live forever.
You're giving me good ideas for blogs. Let me ask one more question, if you don't mind, Alex. In the 80s, I think they were called long-term capital, biggest geniuses around. They created these incredible ARBs, and they basically almost took down the capital markets globally. Could AI make a mistake on our trip through time?
So the question I just heard you ask is, because humans ran LCTM, can AI make mistakes? Of course humans ran LCTM, and of course AI can make mistakes, but I think there's a certain syllogistic inference that I would be extremely hesitant to draw. Yes, AI is going to make mistakes, but intelligence in general, finite intelligence, bounded intelligence, can make mistakes. That doesn't mean that one should infer that more intelligence is bad. If anything, mistakes can be more easily corrected and or preemptively discovered and avoided with more intelligence, not less. So one can too easily point to financial disasters in the past and wonder whether AI is going to cause some sort of systemic disaster in the future. But actually, the fat finger is usually attached to a human meat body.
Alex, you've given us some wonderful things to think about here. I want to ask a wrap-up question here. In a minute or less, what will be the key differences between what we know of as the advisor profession now and what it looks like 10 years from now?
The key differences that or advances?
Advances, either way.
I tend to think, again, envision a world where humans don't need to give financial advice at all. I think, imagine a world where financial advice as a profession, even if this is only a thought experiment, even if, Joe, this sounds dystopian to you, imagine a world where financial advice is no longer a human avocation at all, and work towards that. And I would argue, as perhaps unpalatable as that may sound, it's actually a step in the right direction if humans don't need to be in the loop at all on managing or advising or therapizing regarding each other's finances. This all, I would argue, should be automated. And as we do that, we can free up a lot of valuable human capital to work on much harder problems than advising on financial solutions, and we should.
Joe, I'll ask you a similar 1-minute question. As someone who's been in the advisory profession for roughly 3 decades, what is your take on what we've heard today, and what do you look at as how AI will transform the RIA profession?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, Alex, this is really a great, thank you for the time, and thank you for coming on. I could think back to my career, Bob. I started in the 90s on the floor. So I was a floor trader. There were 5,000 people. We had paper. So you had these slips all over the place. And by 2001, 2002, that was gone, right? That was gone. And that was just automation happening. And I remember I left the floor. I came back, not on the floor, but upstairs. And there were already, Alex mentioned algos. There were already algos. They weren't AI algos. They were algos. And they weren't incredibly good, but they were starting to take more and more advantage of dispersion. So just Exxon trading differently than Chevron and taking, as Alex mentioned, advantage of that ARB. And I helped a company that just didn't recognize what was going on and helped them there. And then, moving on through the financial crisis, things just continued to evolve and grow. And so what I'm telling here is that I've been in the industry for 30 years. My role has changed dramatically over that time. My seat's changed because I've become more experienced. But if my seat was the same, it'd be vastly different. And so what I think the real takeaway here is, listen, we're using AI throughout Obsidian continuously. And my role and my job as the managing partner here is to figure out what people should do and how we should react with it. And I think that's probably the best advice I could give, is that things will change. They change dramatically. It's disruptive. Disruption's scary. But if you lean into it and you understand it and you kind of think, okay, where do I play a role here? Hopefully you could grow and be productive and turn into, whether it's not called a job anymore, or, video games are fun, whatever it is. So, I'm not sure that fully answered the question, but I think it made sense to the conversation.
Great. Joe, just one final thing. For someone who wants to learn more about Obsidian, what are the key deliverables that you as an outsourced CIO will deliver to a client?
Yeah, so we provide full investment responsibility so that advisors could do what they do best: relationship management and holistic planning. And within that responsibility, we are dealing with premium solutions, so non-liquid alts, tax, et cetera. And then we are tech-enabled. We have a tech stack underneath. It incorporates elements of AI to make sure that the operational hurdle is taken care of. So if folks are interested, reach out.
Great. Well, thank you for listening to Advisor Wars with Bob Hoopshire and Joe Halpern, and our guest today, Alex Wisner-Gross. To learn more about Obsidian CIO or Joe's work, we'll include a link to his contact information in the notes that accompany this podcast. You can also find Advisor Wars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and we'll include a link to connect with Obsidian on LinkedIn as well. Stay tuned for our next series of episodes when we turn our focus to tax management. We have a roster of guests lined up who will help us understand the various ways advisors can lessen the tax burden that their clients face with their investments. Thank you, and thank you, Alex.
Anytime.
Obsidian CIO sponsors the podcast to further education and critical thinking about the factors that affect markets and investing. And the podcast does not provide investment advice. Investment advice is offered only to clients of Obsidian CIO who have entered into an advisory agreement and with whom Obsidian CIO has identified individual objectives, risk tolerance, and other investment needs.